Dang.
You're on.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. I'm sorry to tell you, this is the final session of the spring's Education Policy Colloquium series, sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance. But I'm glad you're all here. And my name is Jim Pizer, and I'm honored to be your host for the afternoon for the session today. And I'm also honored to be working alongside Marty West and Paul Peterson, who I believe is going to be gracing us with his physical presence any minute, who are the leaders of PEPG. And actually, this is probably the first time both Paul and Marty have been in the room at the same time, since Paul has been taking his, I guess now, annual, I don't know what the right word to describe it is, leave of Cambridge in order to be in warmer climes in Palo Alto. But over the past semester, we've heard from 7 different speakers on topics ranging from the DOGE, I don't know, offensive, if that's the right word, against the Institute of Education Sciences, to the state of economic recovery post-COVID, from the impact of tutoring on student outcomes to the relationship between student outcomes and economic prosperity. And that's not all. There have been other topics as well. And if you go to the PEPG website, you can see all of it up there in terms of video recordings of the sessions, as well as some of the slide decks that were presented during this session. So please go visit the website. You can check out what's there again from this last semester, but also in the fall of the previous semester and years before. So it's a pretty rich resource, and I would encourage you all to check it out. Today's session is on the topic of school choice, and specifically we'll be hearing from Dr. Chris Campos on the different kinds of choice systems in some of our larger school districts and the differing effects that they have on student achievement. Now, there's a pretty rich literature on school choice and their effects on student outcomes, both for students who are choosers, who enroll in schools of choice, as well as those who don't. But there's less research on how those impacts vary depending on the design of those school choice systems. And we'll be hearing more about that this afternoon. Here in Massachusetts, and especially in places like Boston and Cambridge, intra-district public school controlled choice systems have been in place for decades. In fact, I think we probably had some of the earliest ones in the country. And although they've been generally effective in promoting school integration and providing more equitable access to higher quality schools, their impact on student outcomes is not really all that well understood, and in some cases produce mixed results. And sort of to that point, we heard actually on this forum a couple of years ago from Parag Pathak on research that he did about Boston's busing and controlled choice systems, and he found little positive effect on student outcomes. So Chris's findings should help us put our own particular experience here in Massachusetts into a broader context, and hopefully there's lessons learned that we can apply here. Chris Campos is a visiting assistant professor of economics at Harvard. He's on leave at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He's also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and he received his PhD in economics from UC Berkeley. After Chris's presentation, we'll have plenty of opportunity for questions, answers, discussion, dialogue. We'll give priority to folks in the room, but hopefully we've got some folks who are zooming in online, and we'll try to work them into the conversation. So if you are watching online, please put your questions or comments into the chat, and we'll try to work them into the conversation. And for everybody sort of in the room and online, this session is being recorded, so we're on the record. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Chris Campos. Chris, welcome.
Thanks. Thanks, Jim, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. Today I'll be presenting kind of new work that is co-authored with my colleague Jesse Brown, Eric Shin, and Antonia Vasquez at UT Austin. And so,
One second, Chris. Okay.
And so I want to motivate by just kind of restating a well-established fact in terms of global trends, the adoption of centralized choice systems around the world. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to use the term unified enrollment to correspond to any school district that is using a centralized algorithm to assign students to schools. So that means that parents or families submit applications ranking schools And then that gets fed into an algorithm that takes in those preferences and a given priority structure in that district, and then produces a match. And so that's anytime I say unified enrollment, I'll be referring to a school district that's adopted one of these centralized algorithms. So we look at global trends around the world. Adoption of these systems have been widespread K through 12 systems around the world. Right. So this is from my colleague Christopher Nielsen, who wrote a paper on kind of the adoption of the global adoption of these systems around the world. The United States contributes a data point to this global trend, but within the United States, given the highly decentralized nature of the education system, there's a lot of variation in terms of what school districts can do and what they actually do in terms of how they organize their school choice offerings. And that's where this project originates. And that's trying to systematically catalog, like how are different school districts around the country organizing their choice offerings, right? And are they adopting these centralized choice systems to kind of allocate students to schools? And if so, what can we learn about the variation in the design features? And so when we focus on the 120 largest school districts in the country in terms of enrollment, we find that 68% of them have adopted a unified enrollment system or use a centralized algorithm to allocate students to the different choice offerings these school districts offer. So that's kind of a new fact that kind of arose out of this original data survey collection. We find that among the 120 largest school districts in the country, roughly 12% of them have adopted an algorithm, but also require mandatory participation. That means that families are more or less compelled or required to actively participate in the school choice process in transition years. Right? If your child is transitioning from elementary to middle school or middle school to high school, you're required to participate in the process. If you don't submit an application, you could be administratively assigned, and that means that you could be assigned to a school that's not necessarily a school that's in close proximity to where you live. So you have strong incentives to participate. So school districts that belong to this group include New York City, Boston, New Orleans, among others, right? But it's going to be a minority of the school districts that have actually kind of implemented one of these centralized algorithms or using them. And so the majority of the school districts that have these, there's this opt-in nature or opt-in feature in that families can opt into the choice programs or not opt into participating, but they're not required. And if they don't participate, they'll just be assigned their neighborhoods. Okay. And so the most common way of organizing kind of public school choice education markets in the United States is going to be kind of this opt-in. And what this paper wants to focus on is what are the implications of this opt-in design on outcomes for children. And so, most existing literature that have studied these UE systems is relatively agnostic about selection of participants. You may ask why, and I think typical choice arguments come to mind, right? So on the one hand, these systems give students that are trapped in struggling schools access to better schools, right? So on the one hand, everyone should at least in theory be weekly better off just by having access to these systems. Second, just because parents inherently know what is good for their children, expanding their choice is going to allow them to more effectively choose schools that best suit their children's needs, right? So that's also going to lead to kind of weekly better outcomes for children. Right. But in practice, it's not always clear that the parents of students who would benefit the most from these choice programs or these options are the ones that are necessarily taking up these opportunities. And so information barriers tend to be very large in education settings, right? So it's not always clear that the families that need these kind of options the most can always access systems or navigate the system effectively to benefit for them. And so what I'm going to do now to motivate what we actually do in this paper is I'm going to take a step back, combine the survey data with some national publicly available data. We're going to ask two questions to motivate what we're going to study. First, in the US, do decentralized UE systems reach the students who we would think need them the most? And second, how prevalent are intra-district choice programs? So here we just kind of want to get a sense of like what the enrollment share is in intra-district choice programs. We find that that share is relatively small. Then this may be important, but it's not really kind of reflecting kind of or the sizable share of the population of the United States in terms of who's being affected by these programs. So in terms of who these who is reached in these decentralized districts, we find that choice schools in decentralized districts tend to educate economically advantaged students, right? So there's going to be this sharp gradient in terms of economic advantage. Number two, in terms of how prevalent are intra-district choice programs in the United States, if we compare enrollment from 1998 to 2020, vertical axis on the left-hand side is showing you kind of enrollment relative to 1998. There's been a fourfold increase in the number of students being educated in choice programs. This is going to exclude charter schools. So when I say choice school or choice program, I'm referring to magnet programs, dual language programs, career technical education. There's been a sizable increase in the number of students being educated in these types of programs. In terms of like what that means in terms of enrollment share, The vertical axis on the right and the line on the black line is showing you the enrollment share. And it's leveled out at roughly 6.5% as of 2020. 6.5% a lot or a little. I'm not going to take a stand on that, but I'm just going to compare it to the charter enrollment share, which hovers around 7%. So if you think kind of the charter enrollment share is sizable, then you're likely to think that this is also a pretty sizable number. There's more and more students in the United States being educated by these intra-district run choice programs. Okay, and so I think that really underscores the importance of trying to understand kind of like how we're designing the markets that's going to determine who gets to go and enroll in these programs. And so what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to study the largest decentralized UE system in the country. And we're going to ask 3 questions, right? We're going to be able to zoom in on a particular district and ask who participates in the decentralized system with unified enrollment. What are the potential gains for applicants, right, that decide to actively participate in the process? But we're also going to be particularly interested in what the effects are for the non-applicants. What could these students be benefiting if they actually could actively participate? And third, what are the potential impacts of fully centralizing participation? So what if we made this school district like New York City? Who would benefit and what would be the impacts? Would inequality in educational outcomes go down, or would it get worse? Just to give you a quick preview of the results, in terms of selection into participation, we're finding that the students that tend to actively participate in the choice process in this district with decentralized UE, they tend to be performing 80% of a standard deviation better on standardized exams as they're kind of transitioning from elementary to middle school, right? So this is a really sizable kind of incoming achievement gap. So these kids are academically efficient. In terms of the overall effectiveness of the choice programs in the school district, on average, the average treatment effect is roughly 18% of a standard deviation. So these tend to be higher quality programs. In terms of heterogeneity or who benefits, we find evidence of negative Roy selection on gains. And so what this is saying is that the difference in treatment effects between those who are most likely to apply and least likely to apply in terms of the 90-10 percentile difference is 40% of a standard deviation, right? Moreover, what we're finding is that the students that are least likely to apply are going to have the largest treatment effects, right? So if we could somehow compel their families to actively participate, they're likely to benefit a lot. And so it's going to be preliminary and suggestive, so I won't really have precise results on this today, but you can piece these different pieces of the puzzle together and get at this indirectly, and that UE with centralized participation has the potential to produce substantial reductions in inequality in educational outcomes in large school districts around the country. Okay. Do we do questions or?
So if people have sort of clarifying questions as he's going through, feel free to raise your hand and ask.
Okay.
But in terms of sort of the broader conversation about the implications of all this, let's wait till you're done.
Got it. Okay, cool. So here's a roadmap of what I'll be talking about in the next few minutes. So I'm going to spend a few minutes telling you about the setting and the data. So here we're going to ask who participates and what types of schools are they choosing. Then we're going to focus on access and ask what predicts participation, right? So what is going to be highly predictive of that, and how has access to these choice programs evolved over the past 2 decades, right? So really focusing in on access. Third, we're going to turn to some lottery evidence, and this is going to allow us to kind of answer questions related to the benefits of participants. So these are going to be families that are actively applying, ending up in a lottery, and we can use the lottery to kind of identify the benefits of these choice programs on these participants that are in the lotteries. But then we want to move beyond lottery effects, and then we want to ask questions related to the potential benefits on non-participants, right? So what if we could compel the group of non-participants to apply, like what would be their potential treatment effects? Right, so we can ask questions related to who benefits the most and how is that associated with their inclination to participate. This is going to require us to kind of introduce a model that's going to capture application decisions, enrollment decisions conditional on offers, and that allows us to kind of measure some idiosyncratic taste for participating that we can then correlate with causal effects, and that allows us to trace out the potential impacts, not just for those that are actively participating, but for those that are not actively participating. So the key question here is taste heterogeneity, once you net out distance, application costs, and other observable dimensions of heterogeneity associated with causal effects? And if so, what does that bring? In terms of the setting of the data, I can't disclose the school district, but I can tell you that if it were the UE system that's layered on top of this large school district, if it were its own school district, it would be the 35th largest school district in the country. Roughly 90,000 kids are educated in the choice programs in this decentralized UE system. There's roughly 500 programs that they can apply to. Roughly 20% of families in the school district apply. They're actively participating. Okay. Typical student lives roughly 0.7 miles away from their neighborhood school in this district, but 3.7 miles away from a popular choice program. Popular here means oversubscribed. So they live much closer to non-oversubscribed programs. That just gives you a sense of proximity to like the relatively popular one. And the number of choice options has substantially increased in the past decade. And in a few minutes, I'll show you a figure that kind of shows you that trend. In terms of the data, we're going to have administrative student records, standard stuff in education. We're going to be able to link that to choice program records, applications, program capacities, admission records, and lottery numbers. That's what allows us to kind of do the lottery analysis. This is going to be across roughly 24 years in this large school district. Okay. In terms of who applies to choice programs. So this gray bar should say non-applicants. Apologize about that. And it's showing you kind of the share of attributes among non-applicants. And the maroon bar is showing you kind of mean attributes for applicants. And so one thing we can see is that the students that are applying to the choice program in the school district tend to be roughly or relatively more racially diverse. Right? This is a school district where roughly 80% of non-applicants are classified as Latino or Hispanic, but roughly 50% of the applicants are Latino or Hispanic. So it's definitely predominantly Hispanic Latino school district, but the applicants tend to be more racially diverse. They're also going to be slightly kind of less economically disadvantaged, the applicants are relative to the non-applicants, right? So kind of some of the things that we were seeing kind of in the motivating evidence that took a step back and looked at like who choice programs and these decentralized UE districts reach. What really stands out in terms of differences between applicants and non-applicants is the incoming achievement differences. So this is showing you here that in terms of incoming ELA and math scores, those that are deciding to apply and participate in the choice program, they're performing 80% of a standard deviation higher on standardized exams in terms of ELA and math, right? So a sizable incoming achievement difference. So these kids are relatively academically advantaged compared to the non-participants. In terms of what types of programs they're applying to, we're going to basically get somewhat of a mirror image of what we were seeing in the previous figure. These choice programs tend to be doing better in terms of achievement levels. They're also doing better in terms of their value add. That's not reported here. And in these school experience surveys that the school district runs, the students that are enrolled in the choice programs are slightly more likely to report being happy at their school. It's an indication that these schools are slightly better in terms of their academic outcomes, but also students feel slightly better. Okay, in terms of access, let's now discuss like how access to choice programs in this large school district have evolved over the past 24 years. And so what I'm showing you here are two series. The black line corresponds to enrollment in the school district between 2002 and 2023. And the vertical axis on the left is telling you the number of students in hundreds of thousands. So from the peak in 2004, which was at around 740,000 students, this school district now has less than 500,000 students. Been a sizable reduction in their enrollment. And around the same time, this kind of dashed line is showing you the number of choice programs that the school district offers. And it's kind of, there's been a substantial increase in the number of choice programs. What are these choice programs in the school district? They're going to be magnet programs, dual language programs. That's going to be the primary type of choice program in this school district. Although there's others, so it could be an overwhelming share of them. Right, so access to these choice programs has substantially increased during this time period. What predicts applying? Perhaps not surprisingly, distance. So what I've done here is I've organized different families or students into different distance quartiles, where students in this distance quartile are those that live closest to choice programs. Those in the fifth quartile live farthest away. Those in the first quartile, roughly 25% of families are applying to a choice program if you live relatively close, while 15% of families are applying if they live in the fifth quartile. Right, so living near a choice program is going to strongly predict applying. And perhaps that's not surprising, just given robust evidence we have on the importance of travel time and distance in terms of governing school choices. But if we combine kind of what we're seeing in kind of this time series evidence in terms of just the expansion of the choice programs in the school district, with kind of this evidence on how predictive proximity is in terms of applications, we can then ask what happens to neighborhoods that experience a positive shock in terms of the availability of a choice program relative to other neighborhoods in the school district that have not throughout the sample period. And so anytime there's entry of a choice program in a neighborhood, that increases kind of the number of students that are actively participating in the choice process are roughly 17%. Right, so this event study figure is just comparing neighborhoods that experience kind of the entry of a choice program in its proximity to other neighborhoods that did not experience a similar shock. Right, so you can see that in the years before that shock, application rates are similar between the unaffected and affected neighborhoods. But after the entry, those that are closer to that choice program that entered are going to be applying at higher rates. Yes.
Chris, is this a district with a substantial charter presence? And
Yeah.
if so, are they considered
They're-
are they part of the programs?
They're not. They're definitely heavily exposed to the charter sector. Their charter enrollment share is roughly like 35% in the most recent year that I looked at. They're not going to be part of this. They're outside of the
Could
district.
it be the case that the charters are located in areas where, I don't know, that availability of charters could influence some of the differences you're seeing in participation within district choice?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I wish we could see who's applying to the charter
Yeah.
schools. That's definitely playing a role. Yeah. So if I were to just kind of plot like the time series of just charter enrollment share throughout this time period, it's going to mirror basically this time series. And in terms of the locations, I think they're also going to be highly correlated. So I kind of interpret this figure as expanding the choice programs is kind of the district's response to kind of charter competition. They're bleeding kids and they're saying like, what if we just kind of like experiment with new magnet programs, dual language programs to try to keep some of our kids because they're bleeding kids. That's kind of do that.
But just a follow-up question to that. Do you have any instincts or even some soft data to suggest if charters had been included? How would this picture change?
Oh, yes. So I did look at some reports. So if
And
you
not just this graph, but your whole.
I think the conclusions of the paper will more or less hold, and we can return to why I think that is. But in terms of the overall declining enrollment in this district, that line would be like right here. So the
Yeah.
district has produced reports, just kind of like making projections of what they anticipate enrollment would be in the absence of the charter kind of competition. So yeah, there still would have been substantial enrollment decline due to just demographic change. Yes, Eric.
Chris, often when we think about public school choice that's not charters, we think about magnets. But is this a setting in which there's both magnets, but also you say like when a school choice option becomes available, are some of those school choice options other neighborhood schools that become choice options or?
Yeah, so there's going to be a sizable share of these schools that are just neighborhood schools that now have a magnet
Right.
program or campus or separate thing that's on the same campus.
But does the neighborhood school become you say like when a choice option comes, like is the neighborhood school not a magnet part of the neighborhood school, but the
It's
neighborhood?
going to be a mix of both.
Yeah.
But a sizable share of them are going to be just a school gets a magnet program. That's exactly right. Thank you for clarifying or asking the question. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so kind of the takeaways here is that, access to these choice programs have expanded a lot over the past 20 years. Distance predicts proximity. And, there's going to be policy variation in terms of individuals' access or families' access to these choice programs due to kind of the expansion of the choice programs. That's highly predictive of participation. This is going to be really useful when we turn to identifying things in the model later in a few minutes. Now, let me spend a few minutes talking about the lottery evidence. Right, so the lottery analysis here is going to be pretty straightforward. We have 2 decades of lottery record. If a program is oversubscribed, there's going to be a random lottery that's run to determine who gets offers. Right, so the model we estimate is pretty standard. For an outcome yi, we're going to have lottery fixed effects. Z is going to correspond to offers. X is going to be a vector of baseline controls, just included to kind of improve the precision of these estimates. And beta is just interpreted as an intent to treat effect, or the effect of receiving an offer, not necessarily enrolling. Okay, and then we can balance observables conditional on lottery strata, but I'm not going to show you that. And so I could show you a ton of figures, a ton of tables. This is what stood out to us the most when we did the analysis. What I'm showing you here are intent to treat effects at different distance quartiles. Right, and the thing I want to emphasize in this figure is kind of the gradient with respect to distance. Students that kind of receive an offer and are in close proximity or live in close proximity to a choice program, they tend to experience kind of positive improvements on their academic outcomes, right? And then there's this negative gradient, and it turns negative for students that live in the 5th quartile, relatively farther away. Okay, now you may be thinking, okay, what could potentially explain kind of this distance heterogeneity? On the one hand, we could think that it's variation in the first stage effects, right? It's not that, so I have a button there. Or you can think that it's some other observable treatment effect heterogeneity that's just correlated with distance. Maybe more academically advantaged kids live closer to charter school or to choice programs, And so they just kind of have a particular treatment effect that this distance heterogeneity is picking up. And so to kind of explore this alternative hypothesis, what I can do is I can augment kind of that baseline model I showed you a few slides back with just interactions between different covariate texts and offers. And so then we can hold constant this distance, this treatment effect heterogeneity with respect to these x's and just ask, does that distance gradient still hold? In particular, we're going to be focusing on the Q1 to Q5 difference. So the difference between this point and this point, we're going to see how robust that difference is as we kind of incorporate additional dimensions of treatment effect heterogeneity. When we do that, this is what we get. So the figure here, or this point here, is kind of our baseline estimates, right? The Q1 to Q5 difference without any additional sources of treatment effect heterogeneity. And each one of these additional points here is just adding an interaction between the covariate listed on the bottom and an offer. Right, so we think that the distance treatment effect heterogeneity is explained by any one of these dimensions. These figures or these numbers should go down once we account for that treatment effect heterogeneity. But we can throw in baseline achievement, suspension, everything, and nothing is kind of explaining away that distance heterogeneity. So then the question is, what can we capture? On the one hand, there could be a direct effect of distance. If I now have to travel an additional hour every day to go to school, that's kind of substituting away from me studying, and that could potentially have a direct impact on my achievement. On the other hand, it could be that this distance heterogeneity is capturing something related to preferences and tastes. So what's the intuition behind that? If I live in the first quartile, you don't need to do a lot of convincing to get me to enroll in this choice program because I live really close. If I live farther away, I must really, really like these types of programs for me to be willing to kind of incur or pay these travel costs. Right, so kind of my idiosyncratic taste for choice programs should be relatively high if I'm in quartile 5 or quintile 5 relative to someone that's in quintile 1. Right, so that's a hypothesis. To kind of be able to differentiate between whether there's a direct effect or something related to taste, we're going to need to use a model. This is where we move beyond lottery effects. And so we can model preferences, application decisions, enrollment decisions linked to outcomes to then assess kind of the correlation or the connection between tastes and causal effects. So identification of this is going to require instruments that affect application and enrollment decisions, but that do not directly influence outcomes. And so relative distance, and in particular, policy-induced changes in relative distance is what we're going to use, and offers to choice program. Right, so we're going to combine the policy-induced variation by kind of a substantial expansion of choice programs in the district to kind of get a measure of changes in relative distance, and then offers that are also going to be induced by the lottery are going to be the two instruments we use to kind of identify kind of this treatment effect heterogeneity. Any questions?
Sure, could you give us a sense of how big the differences in commuting time for the first quintile and the fifth quintile?
Oh, yeah,
Like,
it's going to
is
vary
that
depending
2
on.
hours?
Yeah, I think
5 minutes, is it?
I think the max is definitely going to be like at least like 90 minutes for sure, because this district is pretty large, and so there's going to be some portions of the district where like traveling 2 miles is not too costly, but in other parts extremely costly. So it's going to vary, but yeah, I think it's on our to-do list to calculate these travel times, so we don't have it, but
Or even just distances, what is the mean distance in quintile 5?
quintile 5, it's 7.5 miles.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's pretty far, especially in some regions of this district. 7.5 miles is pretty costly. Yes.
Are these buses or is this public transportation or a hybrid?
So in the school district, if you're in middle or high school and you live further than 3 miles away from the school you're enrolled in, district provides public transportation. For elementary schools, that threshold is 2 miles. Unclear if everyone takes up the public transportation. We don't have data on that, but in theory, it's available. Yeah, it's
So if the students who live close are like less of a strong preference, the students who live farther away are a stronger preference, should we not expect those effects to be going in the other, like, are you observing more negative, like worse effects for students who are strongly selecting it? Was that your negative Freud selection?
that's the negative Freud pattern, right? So
Do-
like,
Do you have a sense of like why?
why? Yeah, I mean, I think in education markets, like, I think just information barriers are so large. And so what kind of this component of taste that we're going to capture is not going to be able to say if it's something due to kind of like your true inherent preferences. It could also be distorted by just lack of information. We see someone not actively participating. It's not that they don't necessarily like these programs. It could just be that they're unaware of these programs. And so when we see negative ROI in education settings, kind of like one key kind of explanation that people tend to have is that it's barriers to information. Those that are least likely to apply are just the ones that kind of have the most challenge accessing the information to effectively navigate these systems. So you see it in the charter sector. So Chris Walters had a job market paper, I guess almost a decade ago now. That kind of looked at this in the context of charter schools, same pattern. And so here now we're just going to be focusing on kind of a large public school district that just has this decentralized UE system layered on top of it. And we're going to see that like similar pattern in terms of information friction seems to be preventing some families from applying, but those are the families that are potentially going to be the ones that have the most engagement.
I just ask a follow-up question. So first of all, are the schools included in the sample, elementary, middle and high school?
Great, thank you for asking. I should have clarified this. For this today, it's only middle schools.
It's only middle.
Or
Okay,
students applying from elementary to middle schools.
got it.
Yeah.
So in that case, it's not a matter of like older kids are traveling farther, like they're going to high schools. They're all at the same
Exactly.
transition point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Thanks for asking that.
So, I'm just making sure I understand. Is it the further you go, the less you benefit? That's,
Yes.
so that seems totally upside down, right? That you would think that people would go to the moon,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
If they would really benefit, great. But if they only have to go next door, well, okay. They're not, you don't have to benefit much to decide to go next door. So
Okay.
why is it upside down?
Again, I think it's just going to be information barriers, right? So like, I think it's like the ones that kind of like the people that we're not going to see are willing to travel as far are the ones that we kind of flag as not having kind of relatively large preferences for these choice programs are going to be just families that have trouble accessing the information to even know about applying to these choice programs. That's going to be like the key issue with having these decentralized UE systems have this opt-in design. It's up to the family and the parent to go actively kind of search for these options. And there's always obviously some families out there that just struggle kind of navigating the systems and accessing that information. You can send them mailers, you can send them text messages. They're so swamped, they could be working multiple jobs, and it's just much harder for them to kind of access
But
information.
you would think that the people who travel a long ways would get some really good information about the school that's the destination.
Right.
Before they embark on this.
Right. The people that are traveling away, so we do a lot more to actually show you this in the data. They're probably coming from schools or neighborhood schools that are relatively better, right? So these are motivated parents that are already probably kind of in a neighborhood that gives them access to a pretty decent school, but they want an even better school. But when they go and they kind of search for this magnet program that they end up landing on, it's a magnet program that maybe does well in terms of achievement levels, but relative to their neighborhood school, it's not necessarily higher value. So I think that's why we're going to see kind of these negative effects for those that have really large estimated tastes for choice. It's like these really motivated parents that kind of are already in a pretty decent spot, want something even better, but they just kind of get it wrong in terms of value add. They're doing well in terms of selecting school on achievement levels, because magnet programs tend to be positively selected in terms of achievement levels, but not always that differentiated in terms of value add.
One final question. Is there a monotonic increase across you've got 5 categories there, or is it just steadily increased from 1 to 5? Or is somehow this 5 category unique?
It's like 4.
You can see it a bit for 4 and 5, but you can, yeah, you see it sort of.
So you don't see much until you get to 4, right?
5. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how to click the 2 SLS, but once can someone click that?
Yeah.
Because once you scale by the first stage, you do see it look a lot more monotonic. So the variation in the first stage is kind of what kind of produces kind of the difference between the previous figure and this one. So here you do see a much more monotonic figure once you account for differences and take a break. Yes.
Chris, you may be getting to this later, but how did the district decide where to start the choice programs that could be related to the potential outcomes?
Yeah, so a lot of it's just going to be declining enrollment. I think that like a school is like struggling in terms of their enrollment. And then they're like, hey, what if we kind of experimented with opening up a magnet program?
That would be true, like conditional on the achievement scores of the kids, like 2 schools with similar achievement levels, one with declining enrollment.
So we haven't been able to detect differences in the like trends of the achievement levels of the schools in terms of the ones that open magnet programs and those that don't. But I mean, I do think that there's a concern there in general in terms of where these programs open up or start up are not gonna be random locations in the district for
I
sure.
mean, if the district was smart, they might try to.
Sure.
open choice schools where they would have the biggest effect.
Right, totally agree. Okay, so let me just kind of carry on, because I feel like I'm already going a bit over. So,
You're doing good. Don't worry about it.
okay, so what I'm gonna do now is just go through the model in all pictures and as little math as possible. So the model is gonna have a few stages. The first is the application decision. And so here you see the student kind of deciding like, what school do I want to enroll in next year? And so their decision is gonna depend on the utility they have obtained from the different schools. That depends on their characteristics, how far away they live from each school. That's what DIJ is. There's gonna be this key parameter theta, which is gonna be the idiosyncratic taste that that student has for all choice programs. So there's gonna be no heterogeneity across schools in terms of that idiosyncratic taste. This is gonna be like the key covariate that's gonna come out of the model that allows us to kind of trace out kind of the overall treatment effects for everyone in the population. So once you kind of define utility, the decision to apply depends on your utility application costs, which are gonna depend on your observables and some unobservables. And people are gonna take into account their admissions chances at each school. So they're gonna be rational and being able to forecast that, you know, at this school, I can get in with 0.5 probability because there's 100 applicants and only 50 seats. And so the choice of an application induces a lottery. So students are gonna make decisions using kind of their expected utility. Okay, so they apply, and then offers go out. There's gonna be this group of students that did not apply, and then they just go to their neighborhoods. That's why a student looks happy, because by revealed preference, it's what they wanted to do. And so they go to the school they wanted to go to. Among those that applied, there's gonna be students that did not receive an offer, and those that got an offer. The student that did not receive an offer goes to their neighborhood school. They're a bit disappointed because maybe they wanted to go to the choice program. The student that received an offer now has to decide, do I enroll in the choice program I applied to, or do I go to the neighborhood school? There's gonna be some post-lottery shock that's gonna rationalize why. There's gonna be some group of students that apply to choice programs, get an offer, and ultimately decide to not enroll. Okay, so this is the enrollment decision. Then, you know, if both of these stages, this parameter theta is in there. And that's what's gonna kind of allow us to kind of get at kind of families and students' idiosyncratic taste to kind of participate in the process. What I want to do now is tell you a bit more about the intuition about like what this parameter is and like what we're doing to kind of identify it. So, you know, families obviously differ in observables that correlate with their choices. This group of parents here on the left, someone that's obviously thinking about where to enroll their children in the subsequent year, but they're also concerned about a host of other things, such as bills. So these parents are relatively stressed out. But this other group of parents is, they're only thinking about kind of the school choice thing for their children. And so we obviously don't want to make comparisons across these two groups of parents because they're very different, right? So if we kind of potentially see that these parents here on the left are less likely to participate, it's not because of some inherent preference, it's just because they're concerned about a bunch of other things. And so what we want to do is we want to kind of pick groups of parents that are similar in terms of their observables and just see kind of like the different decisions they're making in terms of applying and participating, things like that. And so we're going to hold constant their X's and where they live, so to speak. And then that allows us to kind of get at differences in theta. What are going to be differences in theta? They can potentially be differences in parental motivation or differences in access to information. We can't precisely identify what governs that the variation in theta, but we can say that it's potentially one of these things. After all of that, students take exams, we observe test scores, and the key question that we're interested in this final portion of the paper is what is the relationship between the causal effects and theta, and this kind of idiosyncratic taste component that we use the model to identify. Okay, how do we actually get at that? We can just estimate the model and then we get estimates of this theta I star. We go into a lot of details there. And the key thing we're gonna do is just kind of like augment a regression of test scores on going to a choice program with estimates of this theta I star, and then these serve as kind of control functions to account for selection, but they also allow us to kind of trace out the relationship between causal effects and the theta star. And again, what identifies all of this? We're going to use policy-induced changes in distance that are going to come from the policy expansion over the past 24 years and lottery offers. That's going to be the two sources of variation that identify everything in this outcome model. And then what we're going to conclude with is something like this, and I'm just going to give you an intuition for the figure I'm going to show you. We're interested here on the vertical axis. What's on the vertical axis are causal effects, conditional on theta. and on the horizontal axis is that theta. What we're interested in is kind of the gradient or the slope of this relationship. It could potentially be positive, meaning that students or families who we observe having larger estimated thetas have larger treatment effects, right? So this would be positive Roy selection on gains, or it could be negative, where those that are kind of have lower theta have larger benefits than those that have larger theta. So here it's those that are least likely to apply that actually have the largest benefit, right? And so that's what we do. That's what I'm going to show you in this figure. And so the first thing before I show you kind of that overall gradient, the average treatment effect that comes out of this model is 18% of a standard deviation. That means that these choice programs on average are effective. Then when we look at the relationship between treatment effects or causal effects and kind of that inclination to participate, we get this negative gradient. Those that are most likely to participate, that have the largest theta, have kind of relatively weaker treatment effects than those that have relatively smaller thetas. Right, and so it's this group of students that would benefit the most from these programs, but they're also the ones that are least likely to apply. So these decentralized UE systems with opt-in nature, this opt-in design, tend to not reach the students that would benefit the most from these types of programs. And so what did I show you today? I showed you kind of establish this new fact that decentralized UE is the most common way to organize, that common way school districts have organized their school choice offerings in the United States. Decentralized UE is understudied, and this opt-in design has natural implications for inequality that we study in this paper. In terms of who chooses, opt-in systems tend to segment the public education system. They reach relatively advantaged students academically and socioeconomically. In terms of who benefits, choice programs produce sizable average achievement effects. They're not reaching the students who would benefit by even more if they could actively participate in the process. So what are some of the takeaways and implications for policy? Decentralized UE systems not only segment the public education system, they potentially also exacerbate inequality in these large school districts. Targeted information interventions or centralizing participation, kind of like New York City, has a potential to produce substantial reductions in inequality educational outcomes for children. So, thanks everybody.
Thank you, Chris. Let me sort of open it up first, maybe Paul or Marty, if you have questions, we can kick off the conversation with.
I guess I'll ask the question about the study. Are you familiar with the MIT study of the Boston, New York?
Mhm.
You know, the longer you travel on a bus, well, the more desegregated the environment that you end up in.
Mhm.
But there's no benefits in terms of achievement.
That's right.
And so that seems a little bit, well, I don't know, is that consistent with your results or inconsistent?
I mean, I do think we find a negative gradient here, kind of the heterogeneity of treatment effects with respect to distance. So it's a bit different. This district is going to be much different from Boston and New York City for sure, in terms of just like how public transportation is organized and how people have to travel to different schools. It's very different. So it's not obvious that the results should be the same.
But you're recommending that you go to this centralized system, which is what exists in New York City and Boston, saying that that will be an improvement on what you have discussed here.
That's
And
right.
so, but that study is pretty carefully designed to see whether or not this centralized system actually yields academic benefits, and they say no. So you haven't, I mean, you're suggesting it would,
Mhm.
but they don't show that it does. But you don't really have any evidence that it does here. You're just thinking it might, given the issues that you have
Right.
identified with the decentralized.
Right.
Uh,
So that's a great point. So I can't show you any evidence yet that kind of this alternative, like a New York style kind of setup in this district would produce better outcomes, but we're in the process of running those precise calculations and counterfactuals using kind of the structure of the model. So probably in like a week or so, I'll know. The reason why it's not obvious that it should produce benefits, even though kind of the results suggest it, is that capacity constraints potentially bite. And there's potential exit from the district, right? So if, you have this influx of kids in a school that you used to like, you don't want those kids to be around your children, maybe some families are going to start leaving the district. So once you take all of that into account, it's a bit ambiguous whether kind of fully centralizing would produce better outcomes for children. So that's why all of this that I presented today in terms of centralization is definitely suggestive. But the pattern suggests that, like, if we somehow compelled those families who are least likely to apply to just participate, they would benefit. And those that are kind of already actively participating, maybe their achievement would be affected negatively, but not by a lot.
I think just one other potential difference is what you mentioned, that most of the choice programs or schools were magnet schools or dual language programs, whereas in Boston and Cambridge, you're just choosing among all of the schools whether there's a specialized program or not.
That's right.
And so it feels like that may be a different
That's true.
context.
That's definitely true. Yeah, yeah.
So let me ask one more related question, and that is, you've compared two different styles of choice programs. But the biggest contrast is between some kind of a choice program and none at all, assignment to neighborhood school, which is the predominant model across the country, even after we've had the introduction of all of this choice. Now, how would you compare your results here to, business as usual, no choice at all? Do you think your 18% of a standard deviation effect could be generalized to that, or?
So some of my past work focused on kind of this particular policy in Los Angeles known as the Zones of Choice program. And it was kind of this program that introduced decentralized choice to roughly 40% of the school district. And this is among high schools in LA. The rest of the district kept the status quo neighborhood-based assignment. So you had this kind of nice within district, a natural experiment to just compare how did the neighborhoods that suddenly had choice compared to those that didn't over time, before and after. I found that those neighborhoods that kind of got the choice program, students in those neighborhoods, their outcomes substantially improved, and kind of the like achievement gaps and college enrollment gaps that existed between the affected neighborhoods and the unaffected neighborhoods were eliminated 6 years after the program. So that program, kind of the evaluation of that program suggests these choice programs do tend to produce good outcomes for children relative to neighborhood-based assignment. This is a bit different because now we have this decentralized UE system layered on top of the whole school district. So it's like, you don't get as neat of a natural experiment to kind of make that type of comparison. But I think my previous work shows that centralized choice programs do tend to produce good outcomes. With that said, the Zones of Choice program is a centralized choice system that does have mandatory participation. So it wasn't optional. So if you live in one of these neighborhoods, you have to actively submit a rank order list, apply to all the programs as your kids are transitioning from middle to high school. So I think that's kind of the best answer I could give, is that I think evidence does show that these choice systems produce good outcomes relative to neighborhood-based assignment. But again, I think the evidence is limited to kind of this peculiar policy in Los Angeles that kind of introduced these programs in 40% of the district.
All right, do you have a question?
Sure, I'll share what I'm thinking about,
Yeah.
and I apologize if I missed sort of something that speaks to this directly. Obviously, the difference in treatment effects across different propensities to choose could reflect the quality of the school you get into, but it could also reflect the quality of the counterfactual school you would attend. Can you separate sort of how much of the variation that you're seeing from high propensity to low propensity is driven by those two factors?
Yeah, so we're working on this in a separate paper to kind of just really understand that margin. I think the fallback really plays a big role. So that's, I think, as much as I can say here. So like what your neighborhood school is does really kind of contribute a lot to like what your individual treatment effect would be.
Yeah, so the low propensity people are coming from places with higher default school quality.
These people that are less inclined to participate
Yeah.
are likely coming from schools
With,
that have
yeah,
lower
lower.
quality.
So I said.
And
the
these,
opposite,
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly that. So that's definitely playing a role. So it's kind of like trying to convince these kids that are in relatively bad schools to just participate in the process. These families are already doing okay. Their neighborhood school is still relatively fine, but they still are kind of chasing something better, and whatever the school they end up deciding on is kind of relatively worse than the one that they would have gone to. So that's kind of more or less what's driving this pattern as well. So you have these really motivated parents that kind of end up making kind of sort of a mistake, so to speak.
But you cross the zero only way out.
And for the most part, everyone benefits a bit. Right.
And are these propensities conditional on distance to an option?
Yeah, this is netting out distance, cost, everything. So yeah.
Let's open it up to other folks who may have questions.
I don't know whether you would have evidence for this or if I'm just asking you to say what you think, about whether this expansion of choice was successful in like keeping kids in the district, or like preventing school closures, like by, opening up this magnet program. Do you successfully keep open a school that otherwise would have closed, and just like the kind of general equilibrium?
In the early, yeah, so this was actually, when we got the data, this was kind of the first thing we had to look at, the thing the district was most interested in. So at least in the early years, like from 2013, 2014, the entry of a choice program did tend to slow down kind of students from leaving the district, but in more recent years, not at all. No impact on enrollment trend. Yeah. So, but I do think that the district views kind of the expansion of these programs as kind of a strategy to combat declining enrollment, but it's just not working out. And
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I was wondering whether you think in terms of cost benefit analysis, when parents have to make the decision about changing the school, and if you have been thinking also about not only the direct cost, which is related also to transportation, longer distance, but also the indirect cost in terms of opportunity cost of time. So parents may perceive that there will be less time for studying or less time for extracurricular activities. Can you also provide a measure if you have been thinking about that?
right, so you're just basically saying if we suddenly now compel everyone to participate, there's going to be a group of families who are going to now be traveling longer distances to the schools they're now in, and so that's going to have some kind of cost on the children. And yeah, so I mean, that definitely could potentially happen. We just don't have the data to kind of precisely quantify like the scope of that, but it's definitely something that, would have non-negligible, I think, in practice, that like the data just can't really speak to precisely. Yeah.
Although the choice programs like in Boston, for example, the choices are weighted. So you may have a first choice, which is, that if you want to choose your local school or school close to home, you get a preference as opposed to someone who's choosing farther away.
That's right, that's right. Yeah, so I imagine, yeah, there's definitely, neighborhood priorities.
Michael, any questions online?
I'm gonna, that last point.
Go for
If it is weighted, if the system is, the lottery is weighted, then the people who have to travel a long ways may not be getting their first choice.
Mhm.
So people who are living close may be getting their first choice. People way far may be getting their last choice among the choices they listed.
Although this in some of the, I don't know, idiosyncrasies of the way they're structured, if you're choosing one that's like in Boston, if you're choosing one that's far away, it's out of your zone. Typically that's because it's a high performing school. And so they actually give some preference to people who don't have good choices locally who want to go farther. So I don't know how it nets out actually on that. It's
Yeah, no,
complicated.
that's a great point. At least for this figure that I showed you, this gradient, the lottery-based evidence, this is all among top ranked schools. So this is for first choice effects, for effects of getting an offer for your first choice school.
Oh, this is from your first choice school.
Exactly.
It's interesting. Michael, was there someone
Yeah.
with a question?
Question from Vlad Kogan, who says, how much of the heterogeneity could be due to differences in the quality of the fallback option for kids nearby versus far away?
Yeah, I think that's what Marty
Oh,
was
sorry.
asking.
Okay.
Yeah, it's playing a role, like definitely, like we don't have.
Good
any
question.
evidence here. But yeah, it's definitely forthcoming in a different way.
Yeah, go ahead, one more.
Does the district provide free transport to every family enrolled in a magnet school or a charter school?
Yes, so if you're in elementary school and you live further than 2 miles away, district provides transportation. If it's middle or high school, it's 3-mile threshold.
One second.
Oh, I see.
So the very high theta family.
Yeah.
I think you also said our high achievement, so like thinking about trade-offs that they might make between sort of language and math skills versus other things they value in schools, like, and be willing to travel a long distance. Like, one thing that comes to my mind is like a arts or performing arts school, that
Sure.
kind of a magnet. It seems unlikely that that's gonna explain a ton of this, but But those sort of very specialized schools, no, these are middle schools, not high schools.
These are middle schools, yeah, yeah.
So they don't have things like that. So what are the magnets then?
I
Like,
mean-
what might a parent be willing to trade off math and language for?
I mean, a majority of these like magnet programs are like STEM themed programs. So they just kind of add a STEM label to kind of this distinct program on the same campus, and
Yeah.
principal will think that that tends to attract more students that are not necessarily like in the neighborhood attendance zone boundary.
So if you did this separately for math and language, like, are these families who are trading off language for math? They're like, I want my kid to go to a STEM school, I'll send them far away.
Yeah, we haven't done that. We could. That's a good point. But there's also a ton of social justice oriented kind of programs here. So that tends to be another common theme. There's also kind of like pre-med type of middle schools and stuff like that. I guess just getting kids really ready. Yeah, and gifted programs are not part of this. That's kind of a separate thing. There's different lotteries for those. But for those, I imagine there's some families that are willing to travel really far to get access to the gifted program, but they're not part of this.
Can I ask you a question that comes from your zone of choice paper? I think you did, so in that context, I think if I'm remembering the sort of the data and the findings correctly, it was, first of all, a zone that was fairly homogeneous in terms of the population.
That's right.
Socioeconomically. But the finding was maybe in part because of that parent choices for their students actually aligned pretty well with school performance. So they were choosing for lack of a better word, the right reasons, as opposed to, observable factors that may reflect biases or other sort of preferences that weren't actually related to school quality. Could you just talk a little bit about that and how that sort of may or may not play into your findings here?
Right, so, yeah, so that's exactly right. So in the zones of choice program, within each market that the program created, everyone was identical in terms of the race and their socioeconomic status. So in other settings where you see that parents tend to choose schools in terms of achievement levels, they're typically using proxies such as kind of like the neighborhood income or kind of just racial shares to kind of identify effective schools. The zones of choice program, that mechanism was shut down. How does that relate to this? Well, I think that's potentially what's happening with this group of parents, right? So like they're groups of parents that like are really motivated, kind of their neighborhood school is already kind of a relatively high achieving neighborhood school. And they go and they find a magnet program that's even kind of better in terms of achievement levels. But in terms of the value add difference, it's not going to be too sizable and potentially negative relative to their neighborhood school. And so kind of the selection on levels is definitely happening, I think, in this sample. And I think magnet programs are perceived to be higher academic quality. That's purely based on achievement level, right? So if you look at, what was this figure, I think? Oh. Average achievement between choice schools, which is going to be a majority of those are going to be magnet programs, and neighborhood schools is pretty sizable, right? It's like roughly 65% of a standard deviation in average achievement levels. And so when people are out kind of searching for kind of choice programs in this particular district, they tend to associate them as like, or think of them as higher quality options. But that's purely based on achievement levels. The district doesn't publicize value add measures and things like that. So families don't have access to that. And so that kind of sorting on kind of socioeconomic status or race, things like that, is definitely going to be highly present in this setting.
But even this might suggest that parents who are not choosing might just not even have access to that information, which, value add is kind of a technocratic term that most people don't really understand, but they do sort of know, or it makes sense to them that, oh, that's a higher, that they have higher test score, that must be a better school, whether it is or not, right? But the perception might be in that way. But even that level of information is, my guess would be, is not available to the large majority of parents, especially those who might be lower income or might have, not have the time, if you will, getting back to the parents worrying about all kinds of other things, to know, that data point. So anyway, the zone of choice finding, as well as sort of this, suggests that some of this might be addressed by better access to information, more proactive outreach to parents to let them know what their options are, including sort of in the choice process itself, so that, as you're choosing schools, you're given information sort of effectively right on the form about is this a good school, bad school? And obviously not, I don't want to use those terms, but those are politically dicey,
Yeah.
strategies, but nonetheless ones that in theory might create more equity in terms of those who choose and those who don't.
I think that's definitely right. Yeah, and I think there's definitely scope to start incorporating kind of like, just LLM-based technology to kind of help parents kind of effectively search through schools, kind of in a way that's kind of more consistent with how they view the world and not necessarily what like a bureaucrat at the district is telling them to look for, but just kind of interact, like dynamic kind of interactions with these chatbots could be effective in terms of just improving the amount of information that they have. Yes.
So I have a question that should make everybody feel very good about this, this district. The Kruger study of class size reduction says that you can get a 0.2 improvement in student performance in the earliest years of education, which is where you can get a lot for a little. And you're getting 0.2 here, more or less.
Mhm.
So this is as good as reducing class size by 8 students. So shouldn't we all be terrifically happy? It really could improve it in little ways here and there, but should we just feel like, hey, they're doing a great job. They introduced a program that really has had remarkable effects.
Yeah, at the end of the day, that's a very like normative stance. I think like depends on what the district wants to kind of like what their objective function is. If they care about inequality, and sure, there's existence of kind of the set of schools that is producing good outcomes for children on average. But the kids who would benefit the most from these programs are not the ones that are accessing them. It's actually the kids that are already doing really well. And so kind of the existence of this kind of system layered on top of this district that has neighborhood-based assignment tends to kind of be widening inequality in educational outcome. So if you just care about having effective programs, then sure, I think this is a success for the district. If you care about inequality, then it's unclear, like this right design feature or this design structure in this district is the right structure.
Yeah, but it is the case that all canoes are rising. All boats are rising in this system, except for maybe just a few way out there on the extreme. So 95% of the boats are rising. So wouldn't, okay, so some are rising more than others, but they're all rising. So it's not like some are losing ground for the benefit of others.
I see.
So if you take that last.
Right, so, let me just be very clear. So like what this ends up doing is it traces out the effects for everyone in the population, including participants and non-participants. So it turns out that a majority of the students that are going to be in this region are actually not participating. There is a lot of potential improvement that these students could have, but these students are the ones that are least likely to apply. We use the structure of the model to be able to learn about what the effects are in the entire population, including those that are not actively participating. So students in this portion of the figure are actively participating, so the probability of them applying and having an application in the data is very high. But for this group of families, it's very low. So you're right that for the most part, all of these points are above 0. But what I'm saying is all of the benefits that this figure is suggesting is accruing to this portion of the figure. So this group of students that's up here, and less so to the students that are right here.
So, but does that mean, am I understanding that to mean that the choosers are benefiting more than the non-choosers?
Yeah, they're already doing better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, this gets back to the extent to which you can increase participation. I get, which obviously a solution would be mandatory, right? Everyone participates, but that to the extent you can increase participation, that and actually even in those numbers, given the demographics of the district, still there's probably a significant share of I mean, my assumption is the choosing population, as the data I think showed, is still predominantly, even though it's more diverse than the non-choosing population, is still predominantly students of color.
That's right.
And so they are benefiting significantly, even though it's disproportionate. But again, from an equity point of view, the overall gap may be shrinking or may not be shrinking as much as it could,
Right.
or in some ways maybe expanding a little bit. However, the disproportionate, a large percentage of the benefit is going towards students of color.
That's right, but that's kind of by design, just because of not so great and maybe potential improvements at the margin.
Except getting back to Paul's question is if your alternatives are stop doing the choice or do more of it, I think you're coming down, you should do more of it.
I think so.
Yeah.
Sure. Just being kind of more careful with the design features. And I think that what we're trying to say in this paper is that how you design these markets is going to have implications for inequality. Should think about that.
Any final questions? Anything else online? All right, Chris, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.